Well, welcome again to Medieval Church History from the Lord's Seminary. And my name is John Butler. I'm a pastor currently in South Carolina, soon to be in Texas, and an instructor with International Theological Education Ministries, or ITEM. In this particular lecture, lecture number 5 in our course, we're going to discuss the growth of the papacy and the claims of papal authority. So let's go ahead and look at our PowerPoint and share that with everybody as well. Let's see, do that and that. All right, and okay, and go to the slideshow. All right then, so we're going in this particular lecture, we're coming to a turning point in medieval church history, the rise of the papacy, how the Bishop of Rome moves from being one of the most important bishops among many to being viewed in the Western Church as the supreme pontiff, the highest bridge with authority over all Christians. And let me begin with a simple question to frame our lesson. When did Rome have a primacy of honor to start to become Rome has supreme jurisdiction over the whole church, or those claims? Now, those two phrases may sound similar, but they are not the same thing. So before we go any further, we need to have a few clear definitions. First, the word primacy. Primacy means first place, a kind of a precedence. It can mean Rome is first in honor, or Rome has a special respect, or Rome has an important voice. Primacy does not necessarily mean that Rome can command other bishops. Second term, supremacy. It means highest ruling authority. It implies that the Bishop of Rome is not only first in honor, but that he has the right to govern other bishops and churches elsewhere. A third word, jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a legal word. It means the right to make binding decisions, especially in disputes, matters of discipline, appointments to various positions in the church, and also in appeals. So when we say universal jurisdiction, it means the claim that Rome can judge cases in any church in any region. So the lecture today is about how the Western Church moved towards centralization, towards a center of power, and how Rome came to claim papal supremacy and universal jurisdiction. So to guide our thinking, here's kind of the roadmap of where we hope to go in this lecture. We're going to look at least 4 major parts. How Rome's influence began, why the Bishop of Rome mattered early on, the foundations in late antiquity, and how people spoke about Rome in the first centuries. Second, how power became centralized in practice through appeals, through administration, through church law, and through political changes in the West. Third, how claims were expressed through papal titles and expanding jurisdiction, and then how those claims were justified, especially through theological arguments and also through documents that were later recognized as forgeries, such as the donation of Constantine. So actually five things today. And we're going to work through these parts, but we need to keep in mind the growth of the papacy was not one single cause that caused it to occur. It was a stacking of influence in that way: historical, political, legal, theological, and sometimes Rome gained authority because people asked for help. Sometimes Rome asserted authority and others resisted. Sometimes the church's desire for unity pushes centralization forward. And sometimes paper authority, documents and legal collections, gave powerful support to Rome's claims. And I also want us to be fair and careful here. We're not here simply to praise or to mock. We're trying to understand what happened. Why did it happen? How did Christians defend it? How did other Christians oppose it? Medieval history is full of sincere pastoral concerns and real political pressures and genuine theological disagreements. So, as we start out, I want to give us one guiding question to hold in our minds through the whole lecture. Which came first, Rome's theology of authority or Rome's practice of authority? Kind of a chicken and egg type of question. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? Um, so, in other words, did Rome develop a doctrine and then build a system around it? Or did Rome become the center of administration and then later develop stronger theological claims to explain and defend what's already become normal? So by the end of this lecture, we should be able to answer that question with some nuance here and to explain the key steps that led from Bishop of Rome to Supreme Pontiff. All right, let's begin this first section now. Why Rome mattered in the early centuries and what kind of primacy Rome first held. Uh, let's look at the early groundwork here. Why did Rome matter here? Well, that's something we've talked about in this course and in the previous apostolic era and early church course. Why did Rome matter at all in the early church? Well, we need to be able to answer that question because if we don't understand that, then the later claims of papal supremacy are going to feel like they just appear out of nowhere. They did not. Rome's later claims built upon real early influences, though the shape and the extent of those influences were often disputed. So, first, Rome's prominence in the world is something we want to examine and why that mattered for the church. Rome mattered because Rome mattered politically, culturally, administratively. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the empire. Even when emperors later governed from other cities, Rome still remained a symbol of unity, of law, of order. Roads led there. All roads lead to Rome, the saying was. Officials reported there. Appeals could be made there. And so the habits of imperial administration just didn't vanish overnight. And that matters because the church did not come up, did not grow in a vacuum. Early Christians in the West learned to live, to worship, to organize themselves inside an imperial world. So it's not surprising that in the West, especially, Rome became a place where people expected leadership and arbitration and coordination. So we have to be careful, though. Political prominence does not automatically create spiritual authority, but it does create influence, especially influence that later can be interpreted as authority. There's also apostolic association with Rome, the apostles Peter and Paul. It was widely recognized as an apostolic church with roots being linked to the ministries of Peter and of Paul. They remember Rome as a place where the apostles had labored and where martyrs had died. And that gave Rome a moral weight, as it were. When an important church like that speaks, people listen. So when a church is closely associated with apostles and martyrs, people then listen even more. So this is where the Petrine or connected with Peter, connection begins to matter. Not everyone early on interpreted Peter's significance the same way, and not everyone believed Rome had the exclusive rights to Peter. But Rome increasingly presented itself as a church with a unique link to Peter's legacy. So here you can already see the seed for later arguments. If Peter had unique authority among the apostles, and if Rome is Peter's seat, where his base of operations, then Rome may claim unique role among the churches. That's how the argument would run. The reasoning is later going to become more developed, but the basic association was already there. Another thing is Rome's reputation for stability and orthodoxy. In many periods, Rome had a reputation for doctrinal steadiness, especially compared with some regions that were just rocked by repeated controversies. In a time when heresies and schisms could fracture churches, believers often looked for reliable standards. So Rome wasn't perfect, and Rome did not always get things right, but the perception was that Rome was a stable anchor, particularly in the western part of the Roman Empire. Again, perception is not the same thing as legitimate universal authority, but reputation is a powerful thing. So when churches feel threatened, they often seek a center. And that leads to a key insight, a desire for unity and a fear of fragmentation can create strong pressure towards central leadership. Early language about Rome often discusses Rome's influence and yet not universal supremacy. This is a crucial distinction here. In the early centuries, you do find language of respect for Rome and sometimes even strong statements about Rome's importance. But much of the early language fits better under primacy than under supremacy. That is, Rome was treated as a leading voice. Rome is often honored. Rome may be asked to assist. Rome may be consulted. But this is not yet the fully developed claim that the Bishop of Rome has immediate jurisdiction over every church and over every bishop in the whole world. So it's best to say Rome's authority is real, but often informal, and it's often contested in this earlier period. Now, early flashpoints that occur often prefigured later papal claims. To see how this influence of Rome begins to function beyond its local region, consider a few recurring patterns that appear early and become stronger later. One, disputes and requests for help. Someplace a controversy erupts and a church looks outward for counsel. There's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. Rome responds with a letter or advice or it's giving its judgment, and that response is remembered and cited. And that's one of the key ways that authority grows. It's not only through assertion, but through being asked. Another is through appeals and arbitration. When local decisions are disputed, and whether in disciplinary cases or excommunications or contested elections, some parties seek a higher court. Now, when we're talking about contested elections, early on, you had bishops were elected by the people and to govern over the church, and sometimes you would have these elections contested. How do you decide who is the true bishop and who isn't? And Rome would be appealed to with regards to that. So Rome becomes increasingly a place where people appeal. And even if this begins as something that's an exception rather than the rule, exceptions that repeat become customs. Another has to do with church councils and interpretations. The early church is what's known as conciliar. that the bishops gather, they deliberate, and they rule together in council together. But Rome increasingly acts not only as a participant, but as an interpreter, sometimes as the one who claims to confirm and stabilize conciliar decisions. It's the that the council has decided, but Rome is the one who mediates that the decisions come through Rome, and Rome has the correct interpretation. Well, that's important. Um, Later claims on Rome's part will say, in effect, councils have authority, but the council's authority is fully secure only when Rome confirms it. So, whether one accepts the claim or not, you can begin to see how this will shift the balance. Rome is no longer merely a brother among bishops, but a kind of guarantor of things. So, we see that development is uneven and resisted at times. It's not a smooth, inevitable climb. It is, fits and starts and rocky and so forth. But over time, more and more people bend to that influence. Uh, Rome's influence will grow, but it is not universally accepted in the same way everywhere. For instance, in the eastern part of the old Roman Empire, so we're talking Greece, Turkey today, Syria, Palestine, Egypt. Um, Rome is often recognized as first among patriarchies, but the universal jurisdiction of Rome is resisted. But in the West, as the political structures weaken, Rome's stabilizing role becomes more attractive. And yet, even in the West, the bishops and rulers sometimes will have a little bit of pushback against Roman intervention. So you can see that early on, the dynamic that's going to shape the medieval period. Rome claims an increasingly central role. Some are going to welcome it for unity and for stability. Others are going to resist it as an overreach. So if we're to summarize this section in one sentence, it would be Rome begins with genuine prominence, political, apostolic, reputational, so that its influence is real, but the claim of universal supremacy is not yet fully formed. And so the question becomes, how does influence become structure? How does respect become a system? How does occasional arbitration become regular jurisdiction? So that takes us to our next section where we're going to examine the concrete mechanisms that centralize church power, especially in the West, through appeals, through decretals, through legates, and the growth of canon law. All of these things are unfolding alongside massive political changes after the decline of imperial authority in the West. So let's look at the influence, from influence to centralization, how the power actually accumulated. So, how did Rome's influence shift to become a system? How did the Bishop of Rome move from being consulted to being appealed to as a court and eventually acting as a governing center for the Western Church? And the answer is that papal authority grew through repeated practical mechanisms. Each mechanism by itself might seem modest, but lumped together, taken together, they create a habit of centralization until in many places it becomes the default. One way is through appeals from an emergency option to a normal pathway. One of the strongest engines of this centralization process is the appeals process. In the early stages, an appeal to Rome might occur when there's a local conflict that becomes unmanageable. Perhaps an unjust deposition of a bishop, or a contested election, or a discipline dispute that divides a region. when the local synods disagreed, or when the parties distrusted local leadership, they sometimes sought a decision from outside. And at first, that could feel like a practical act of seeking help. We need wise counsel from a respected church. There's nothing wrong with that. There's wisdom in a multitude of counselors to consult somebody else to come. Sometimes uh, matters can become so convoluted, and everybody has their own particular opinion. You can't get a fair hearing on something. It makes sense to let's give this to an outside arbitrator to come and give us counsel in this, or that we'll both agree to submit to what their decision is. Well, over time, the appeals process changes in its character. So what begins with "please help us out" becomes "you must hear our case." And what begins as a pastoral intervention becomes a legal expectation. And what begins as exceptional becomes precedent. So once precedent accumulates, it becomes powerful. A single appeal may not redefine authority, but 1,000 appeals across the centuries create a new normal. Rome then begins to function as a higher court. And that's a subtle but a massive shift here. So when a bishop or a cleric believes that Rome can overrule local decisions, Rome's role is no longer merely honorific, it is jurisdictional. Another way is through decretals. These are papal letters that become law. At first, these papal letters are pastoral correspondence, advice, exhortation, counsel, rebuke, encouragement. But as the disputes come to Rome, Rome answers with decisions, and these decisions are recorded and they're circulated and they're reused. And so here's the key dynamic. First, a local church asks Rome for judgment. Second, Rome replies with the decision and its reasons. Third, that decision is copied and quoted elsewhere. And another church faces a similar dispute, and so they will go back, hey, wait a minute, Rome answered this question before, or what Rome answered in that matter touches on some of the matters that we're dealing with here. And so they cite that earlier Roman letter as an authority. So over time, the papal letters become something like case law, a body of decisions that can be referenced in new cases. Look, the court's ruled in this particular case in a matter that is the same or similar to what we're dealing with, and we're going to appeal to that decision and the principles that were enumerated in that particular decision. So Rome's power is strengthened not only by what Rome says in the moment, but you end up having this growing library of what Rome has said over time, a developing archive of papal rulings that slowly take on legal force. And that's what we might call authority by accumulation. Another has to do with what's called canon law, C-A-N-O-N. The church becomes more legal. This is a canon refers to a reed that would be used as a measuring stick. And so becomes the standard. And Rome becomes the legal center. You've got this expanding world of canon law developing. As the medieval church grows, it becomes more complex. You've got more clergy. You've got more monasteries. You have more property disputes. You have more marriage cases, how to rule in various matters related to marriage and family. You've got more discipline issues. You have more questions of boundaries and rights. You have more conflicts between church leaders and civil rulers. So a growing complex institution naturally seeks to standardize procedures. And that pushes the church towards law, collections, codes, courts. And as canon law becomes more central, the question becomes, who interprets it? Who has the final say? And here Rome increasingly would claim the role as the final interpreter and ultimate judge, especially in the West. And in other words, as the church becomes more legal, it also becomes more centralized because law tends to gather around a recognized final authority. Uh, Another way that we see this influence or moving from influence to centralization is through legates and representatives. Rome's authority becomes more visible and enforceable. A papal legate is an official representative sent from Rome. A letter can be ignored. A delegated leader coming in and speaking to you is a bit harder to ignore. So when a papal legate arrives, he brings papal instructions, the weight of Roman authority, and often the power to preside in councils, to settle disputes, to enforce discipline. So we might say in diplomacy, he is an ambassador, but with plenipotentiary powers. He has granted authority and delegated authority from the Pope to act in his stead or to ensure that his wishes are carried out. And that's crucial because the legates make Rome's claims practical. Authority is not only an idea, it's embodied in agents who carry it into the local churches. And once local bishops become used to papal representatives appearing and presiding and judging, the center becomes part of ordinary church life. Another way that Rome is moving from influence to centralization is in the area of appointments and confirmations. Power grows through networks of loyalty. In many periods, Rome's direct control over appointments is limited. But gradually, Rome's role increases through confirmations and approvals and interventions, especially when disputes arise over who should hold an office. And here's why that matters. People who owe their office to a process involving Rome are more likely to treat Rome as a superior authority. And over time, that creates a network of relationships that reinforce centralization. That doesn't mean that every appointment was controlled by Rome. It was far from it. But even limited involvement can create a pattern that strengthens Rome's influence. Also, we have the factor of political changes in the West. Rome becomes a stabilizing institution, as we've seen so far in this course. With the weakening and collapse of Western imperial structures, the West experiences fragmentation. The regions are ruled by various kingdoms, and political authority is often unstable. So it's in that environment that the church is one of the few institutions that can preserve continuity, learning, administration, moral authority, and a sense of unity across regions. Rome is an ancient and symbolic center. It becomes especially important for many Western Christians. Rome appears as a stable anchor when everything else is in flux. So centralization can feel to many people like a blessing. We need order. Here's order. We need unity. Well, we can bring that. We need a final court. Yep, we can fulfill that function. We need a voice that can resist local tyranny or corruption. Church can step in that regard. So in other words, Rome's growth is not only an ambition to rule, it is also often a response, sometimes welcomed, sometimes pushed back against, but it's sometimes welcome to the realities of a fractured West. So what happens then is you have this cumulative effect of all these things we've just discussed. They create a habit of looking to Rome for answers. So none of these mechanisms by themselves automatically create papal superiority and supremacy. But together they create that habit of disputes, go to Rome. Rome's letters become precedent. Canon law is elevated to the need for a final interpreter. Legates make authority enforceable. Appointments build networks of loyalty, and political fragmentation makes a central anchor to be attractive. And once that habit is established, it becomes very difficult to reverse. What people do repeatedly comes to be viewed as what the church ought to do. Practice becomes principle, in effect. Well, how were these claims expressed as titles and jurisdictions? We've mostly described practice, but now we're going to look at, what does this mean? And what is Rome's office exactly? And if Rome can judge bishops and settle disputes everywhere, what title fits that role? And what's the scope of the Bishop of Rome's jurisdiction? So now we're going to move from practice to expression, from mechanisms to claims. And we see that in the various papal titles and jurisdictions. So how does Rome describe its authority? How the language shift from Bishop of Rome to Vicar of Peter or Vicar of Christ or Supreme Pontiff, and how those titles reshape what Christians believed about the structure of the church. So let's look at this here. What does it mean when we're constantly looking to Rome, when a practice becomes normal? And once that question is asked, authority is expressed not only through actions, but through the titles, the type of language you use, the formal claims of jurisdiction. So we're going to see how Rome's growing role was named, explained, and increasingly asserted. See, titles are not just mere labels. They shape expectations. And we should begin with an important principle. Titles don't merely describe authority, they help create it. So if Rome is called first among equals, people expect honor and respect. If Rome is called universal pastor, people expect oversight. If Rome is called vicar of Christ, people begin to think in terms of representation. Christ shepherding mediated through one office. So these titles become a kind of public theology. They teach people how to think about the church, how to imagine the church. Early on, the title Papa, Father, is used more widely, but in the Western Church, it gradually becomes increasingly associated with the Bishop of Rome. And that narrowing matters. It's one small way the West begins to treat the Roman bishop as uniquely the father of the church's leadership. Again, this is not a complete history, or complete theory of universal supremacy, but it is a cultural shift. Rome is being singled out by language that people use. The term pontiff. In the Roman world, the title Pontifex Maximus had been associated with the highest religious office in the old pagan Roman Empire. You had the highest priest, because Pontifex is bridge. And so Maximus, greatest or highest bridge between heaven and earth. And so over time, the language of pontiff and the high priestly leadership become attached to the Roman bishop. Now, even if medieval Christians did not always reflect continuously on the pagan roots of that title, the effect is clear. Rome's bishop is framed as the one holding a supreme religious office. So when people speak this way repeatedly, it forms the imagination. There is a highest office that naturally belongs to Rome. Another term, vicar of Peter, uh, and this is important with the growth of what's called Petrine succession language. Um, Rome's connection to Peter is an apostolic association, and over time it becomes something stronger. Peter's understood not only as an apostle, but as the one given a unique leadership role among the apostles, and thus as a pattern for a unique leadership office within the church. So the Bishop of Rome is increasingly described as Peter's successor, not merely as one bishop among many who succeed the apostles, but the bishop who succeeds Peter in a special sense. So that's why the phrase vicar of Peter carries weight. Vicar is a representative, one who acts on behalf of another. So if the Bishop of Rome is Peter's vicar, he's understood as exercising Peter-like authority for the good of the whole church. And so this language strengthens the shift from primacy to supremacy because Peter's role is interpreted as having universal significance. Uh, Alongside of Vicar of Peter, we also hear the Pope being described as the Vicar of Christ. And this is the most expansive representative claim. It doesn't merely imply Rome has apostolic heritage. It suggests Christ's shepherding and governance of the visible church is uniquely represented and mediated through the Roman pontiff. So we have to notice here what this does. If the Pope is the vicar of Christ, then the Pope is not simply first in honor or first among patriarchs. He is, in the Western imagination, the visible head of the church on earth, acting in a representative capacity. So even when we frame this in pastoral terms, care, unity, protection, it naturally strengthens claims of universal jurisdiction. And so how the scope of Rome's authority is expanded is how we see this jurisdiction assumed. We have to connect the titles now with the concrete question: what is the scope of Rome's jurisdiction? What are its powers? What does this power extend to cover? And that's where the medieval papal claims begin to grow sharper. The Roman bishop's authority begins to be described in tiers, moving from local to universal. So you can think of it like a widening circle. You have local jurisdiction, which would be the Diocese of Rome. There's no controversy there. Rome governs Rome. And then regional influence, Italy and nearby churches, Rome's seniority is often recognized. And then patriarchal authority, the Western Church. Rome functions increasingly as a patriarchal center, and then universal jurisdiction, authority over all bishops and churches. And this is the decisive shift. Rome claims the right to judge and govern anywhere and everywhere. And notice how the titles support this. Bishop of Rome fits that first tier, that local level. Patriarch of the West, that level, level 3 we mentioned here. Vicar of Christ, well, that's definitely universal. So how were these claims practically expressed? Well, it often appeared in several ways. One, the right to hear appeals from anywhere. If anyone can appeal to Rome, Rome effectively becomes a supreme court. Second, the right to judge bishops. If Rome can judge bishops, Rome stands above bishops in a jurisdictional sense. The claim to confirm, correct, or interpret councils. If councils require Rome to okay the decision of a council, or to Rome requires, look, our interpretation is the correct interpretation of what the council has said. Any other interpretations are invalid. Rome then becomes the final key of conciliar authority. Another is this authority to send legates with binding power. Rome's jurisdiction becomes visible and enforceable. And last, the power to grant privileges and exemptions, especially for monasteries and clergy. This can bypass local episcopal authority, the local bishop, and the institutions directly to Rome. So what you would have is all regular, ordinary Christians and priests in a given area are subject to the authority of that bishop. But at times you will see certain monastic orders uh, able to bypass the local bishop's authority, and they are answerable directly to the Pope or the Pope's direct representative to deal with them. And so what happens is that's going to create some tensions between the jurisdiction of the bishop over the area, and these people are operating somewhat independently of that bishop's authority as well. So, put together, the papal office increasingly appears not merely as a respected voice, but as a governing center. Why does this matter? Well, what happens is that the church's structure is being reimagined. It's adopting a new way of looking at the church, of considering what the church is and does. And it's not simply a communion of local churches led by bishops and councils, but a church with a visible head, a legal center, and a universal court. And that doesn't erase councils. Councils remain significant, but it changes the balance because councils are increasingly seen as working with Rome, under Rome, or at least requiring Rome's decisive confirmation. And that shift becomes one of the greatest fault lines of medieval and later church history. Well, uh, in this next section, we're going to see how there's a shift here from paper authority and forged foundations to bolster claims of legitimacy. And that's kind of an uncomfortable reality here. As Rome's claims expand, titles now grow grander, jurisdiction broadens, centralization deepens. The medieval church increasingly relies on documents to justify these claims. Because in a legal and institutional world, what is written carries enormous power. And it leads to the next section. Forged documents, especially one known as the Donation of Constantine, along with other forged or expanded canonical materials, arise or appeal to. And so we're going to examine what were they, why were they persuasive, how they were used to strengthen papal authority, and what does it tell us about the way authority was argued for in the medieval world. So let's look at this issue of forged documents and paper authority. And looking at this, as a modern uh, reader, as a modern hearer of these things, it is just incredibly shocking how they could do this. Um, but it made deep sense within a medieval legal culture. Uh, in a world where rights were often established by charters and privileges and ancient precedents and legal collections, a document didn't merely record authority, it could create authority in the minds of those who received it. And this is what we might call paper authority. And in that setting, forged documents could have enormous influence, sometimes for centuries, because they appeared to supply what every institution wanted, ancient proof. So we'll examine two major examples. One called the Donation of Constantine, and another the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. Now, why was the medieval world vulnerable to documentary power? before we name these forgeries, we need to understand the environment. In the early medieval West, political structures were fragmented, literacy was not universal, archives were uneven, and institutions often had incomplete records. But at the same time, there's a strong belief that legitimacy should rest on antiquity. This is how it always has been. This was established by the fathers. This was granted by emperors and confirmed by councils. So when disputes arise about jurisdiction or appointments or monasteries or property or the right to judge, people are going to ask, where is the authoritative text that proves this, that grants that power to Rome? Show me the legal proof that you have the right to do as you say you do. And so you come forward with a document that appears to be ancient and imperial and or apostolic. That could settle disputes quickly and decisively. They would submit to that. And that's precisely why forged texts were so effective. They didn't invent the desire for centralization, they fed it and accelerated it. So let's look at the first, known as the donation of Constantine, and what it claimed and why it mattered. It's perhaps the most famous medieval forgery. What did the donation claim, in essence? Well, it purported to be a decree from the Emperor Constantine. And in substance, it claims something like this: Constantine honors the Pope and the Roman Church as supreme. It grants Rome special privileges and authority, and it transfers significant temporal power to the Pope and the Roman Church in the West. In other words, it portrays the emperor as publicly acknowledging that the Pope possesses a unique superior role, and that this superiority is confirmed by the highest political level. Now, whether the text of the donation of Constantine emphasizes spiritual authority or temporal authority or both, the underlying message is the same. Imperial power recognizes, legitimates, and donates, in a sense, superiority to the papacy. That's why it's called the donation of Constantine. Why was that claim so useful? Why did it matter? Because it offered a simple and compelling foundation for later papal arguments, especially when papacy and emperors, or popes and kings, were in tension. If you can say, look, the emperor himself granted this, then you can argue that papal authority is not a novelty or a mere ecclesiastical tradition. It's rooted in imperial history and legal precedent. So the donation served as a powerful tool for claims such as the Pope's superiority over secular rulers in certain matters, the papacy's right to exercise temporal authority in the West, and Rome's supremacy among bishops and churches. It gave papal authority an aura of official, ancient, public legitimacy, as if it was settled by the greatest Christian emperor, Constantine himself. How did it function in practice? Well, it was not merely read as an interesting story, it was cited. It entered legal and political arguments. It could be appealed to when there were disputes arising between church and state, or between bishops and the papacy. It supplied what medieval institutions often lacked: a clean, definitive origin story that made current claims appear to be simply the continuation of an ancient settlement. Now, eventually, scholars demonstrated, you know what, the donation was not authentic. And in time, the Western world came to recognize it as a forgery. And the exposure matters far more than one reason. It matters historically because it shows how fragile documentary traditions could become. It is also of great matter morally. It raises the question of how the church should pursue authority and defend its claims. And it also matters institutionally. Once a forged foundation is removed, people are forced to ask whether the whole structure built on that forgery can still be defended on other grounds. But don't miss this point. Even when the donation was exposed, papal authority didn't vanish, didn't just all of a sudden disappear, because papal power rested on many supports: practice, law, politics, theology. So the donation didn't create everything. It served as an amplifier and a weapon in argument. The other set of documents is a bit more subtle and perhaps influential, the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals. What were they? Well, the decretals are a collection of documents, supposedly ancient canons or ancient laws and papal letters, presented as if they came from early centuries, especially from the early bishops of Rome. But many of these materials were forged, altered, or compiled in misleading ways to produce a desired legal effect. So it's crucial to see the difference from the donation. The donation sounds grand and imperial. Constantine gave it. The Pseudo-Isidorian collection sounds pastoral and ancient. The early popes always taught it, kind of mentality. And that second kind of forgery is often more persuasive because it seems less political and more ecclesiastical. So what did they claim to accomplish? Well, the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals had several major effects, but one in particular stands out. They strengthened the idea that the clergy, especially bishops, should be protected from local political pressure and from arbitrary deposition put out of their office, by providing broader rights of appeal and by elevating papal authority in judicial matters. In other words, they present Rome as a necessary legal safeguard, a court of last resort, and a protector of the clergy. And that's important because it gave papal authority a strong moral appeal. Rome protects the innocent. Rome prevents injustice. Rome guards due process. Now, whether that always happens in practice is another question, but the legal theory is powerful behind this. So, how did it strengthen papal supremacy? Well, at least in three ways. One, they increased the scope and frequency of appeals to Rome. If it is always lawful, even expected, to appeal to Rome, then Rome becomes the Supreme Court in fact. Second, they raised the status of the papal decrees as legal standards. Papal rulings become not merely advice, but binding precedent for the whole church. And third, they weakened the local episcopal courts, the local bishops, by offering exemptions and procedures that bypass local authority. Now, this doesn't remove bishops, but it reorders the system so that bishops increasingly function under a higher legal center. So, while the donation of Constantine provides a grand claim of papal supremacy from the emperor, the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals provide something more subtle, a legal architecture that normalizes papal jurisdiction. Now, why do people accept them? You know, on our end of things, looking back at this, you could go, how could this fool people? But remember, there's limited access to original archives at that day. There's no internet that you could pull up and look at the archive. There's no, it's not as broadly, the collection of these things broadly disseminated out there and in different repositories and so forth. You have a greater reverence for antiquity and a legal culture that depended on documents and real pastoral problems. You have corruption, you have political interference, you have unjust depositions taking place. So in many places, the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals worked because they seemed to solve genuine problems. They offered order, and protection. They strengthened the center against the chaos of local powers. So these forgeries were not only manipulative tools, they were also, in some cases, instruments used to address real injustice, though by questionable means. So, what do forged documents reveal about medieval arguments for authority? Uh, Forged documents reveal at least four things. Authority was increasingly argued in legal terms, not only who is holy, but who has the right. Second, antiquity was a major source of legitimacy. The older something sounded, the more persuasive it could be. You see that even today. You see people leaving Protestantism and going to the Roman Catholic Church under claims, well, the Roman Church is more ancient and is somehow closer to the truth of things. And therefore I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to what is more ancient and seems to have more legitimacy that way. Not does it square with Scripture or not? And a third reason why people would fall for these forged documents is centralization was seen by many as a remedy for disorder. So even when the forged documents were wrong, the needs they addressed were often real. And fourth, the boundary between pastoral care and legal supremacy becomes blurred. Rome helps can quietly become Rome rules. So the forgeries, though, are not the sole cause of that shift from Rome as first among equals to Rome being the supreme authority. They help accelerate that, but they're not the cause itself. It's better to say the papacy rose through a long process of centralization in the West, and forged documents provided powerful accelerants to this, giving ancient proof for claims that were already being practiced and increasingly asserted. So the forgeries make the claims easier to defend, easier to impose, and harder to resist. Well, another factor that bolsters Rome's shift has to do with doctrine. The strongest, even the strongest of legal arguments are not enough in the church. The church also asks, what does Scripture teach? What is the theology of the church's unity? How is authority distributed among bishops? What did Christ intend for the structure of his church? And so we're going to examine the theological justifications. We're going to look at the Petrine passages in Scripture and the need for visible unity in the church and the idea of apostolic succession and the claim that Rome serves as final guardian of orthodoxy. So, because the medieval church did not want authority to rest only on politics or paperwork, it wanted to be able to say, this is grounded in Scripture. This serves the unity of Christ's church. This reflects apostolic order. This protects the faith. So we'll consider some of the main theological arguments used to support papal authority, and especially that of papal supremacy and universal jurisdiction. And then we'll note how the major objections were raised by other Christians within the medieval world. First has to do with the Petrine foundation, the Scripture texts and their interpretation. The strongest theological case for the papacy in the medieval world that was put forward is often called the Petrine argument, that Christ gave Peter a unique role, and that role continues in Peter's successors, especially in Rome. So they would appeal to, for instance, Matthew 16, 18, and 19. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I give you the keys of the kingdom. So whatever you bind and whatever you loose. So a medieval papal argument would often proceed like this. First, Peter received a unique commission from Christ. Second, the keys represent governing authority in the church. Third, binding and loosing includes judicial authority, discipline, doctrinal decisions, governances. Fourth, that authority didn't die with Peter. It continues in the church for the church's good. And fifth, since Peter's chair is in Rome, the Bishop of Rome is Peter's successor and thus holds this continuing authority. Now, notice this entire argument depends on certain interpretive steps, especially that jump from Peter's personal commission to an ongoing office, and then from that office to Rome uniquely. And that's why this passage remains central. It can be read in different ways, but it is a cornerstone for medieval papal claims. A second one is from Luke 22, verse 32. Jesus says to Peter, I've prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. So a medieval argument would draw out Peter has a stabilizing role for the other apostles. And that stabilizing role is a pattern for the church. Someone must strengthen the brethren, preserve unity, and guard the faith. And therefore, the Pope inherits that function as Peter's successor, especially in moments of crisis. And that text often used to support not only authority, but also a special role for Rome in doctrinal guardianship. Another passage is John 21, 15 through 17. Christ is repeatedly commissioning Peter to shepherd the flock. The medieval reading says Peter is given pastoral oversight of Christ's sheep. And since Christ's sheep are everywhere, Peter's commission has universal scope. And therefore, Peter's successor has universal pastoral responsibility. So the logic goes commission, universal scope, succession, Rome. Now, whether one finds that logic compelling or not, it has a certain internal coherence, especially when you join it with the growing medieval conviction that the church needs visible unity and final arbitration. A second major theological justification is the argument from unity. The medieval church looked at the threats of fragmentation, of regional rivalries, and doctrinal disputes and schisms, and political interference and moral corruption. And many concluded, look, if the church is one, she has to have a visible center of unity. So what the Pope is presented as being the focal point of communion, the final court of appeal, the guardian who prevents local disputes from becoming universal schisms. And so the argument often will have a pastoral tone. Without a head, the body's divided. Without a final voice, controversies will never end. Without a center, the church will splinter. And you can hear the practical concern under this theology, a desire for order and peace in a turbulent world. Another justification comes from how medieval Christians understood apostolic succession and church order. Many medieval Christians held Christ appointed the apostles appointed bishops and elders. Therefore, the church is not a free association. She is a divinely ordered body with offices. And so from that argument develops, look, if the bishop succeeded the apostles generally, and the Pope succeeds Peter uniquely, and therefore the Pope holds a special primal authority among bishops. Well, in that view, papal authority is framed not as an invention, but as the completion of a hierarchical order. The local bishops govern the local churches. Councils coordinate, but the papacy gives the final coherence and unity. He's the glue in that sense that holds it together. Another argument is Rome is the final doctrinal arbiter. They are the protector of orthodoxy, a guardian of it. The argument is doctrinal disputes threaten salvation and unity. The church needs a final judge who can settle these disputes definitively. And Rome's historic role in doctrinal controversies and its connection to Peter support the idea that Rome can serve as that judge. Well, the claim can be made in a couple of ways. One, pastoral. The Pope preserves the faith. The other is juridical. The Pope has the authority to define and judge doctrine. And once that doctrine is tied to jurisdiction, supremacy becomes more plausible here. So if Rome must protect the faith everywhere, then Rome must have the authority everywhere. Well, how did medieval Christians, and there were some, who resisted these claims? Not everybody just rolled over and accepted what Rome was putting out. Resistance took several major forms. One, the conciliar principle, that authority existed through councils. Many insisted the church's highest visible authority lies in councils and not in bishops. And one bishop, excuse me. Their reasoning is the apostles acted collegially. The early church settled major disputes by councils. Therefore, the proper pattern is conciliar governance, bishops together under Christ. So they might grant Rome honors at first among equals, maybe even some special influence, but they resisted the idea that one bishop holds universal jurisdiction over all others. In the East, the critique was, yes, Rome has a primacy of honor, but not the supremacy of jurisdiction. Their concern was not merely political rivalry, it was also ecclesiological. They saw the church as a communion of local churches, and patriarchs have spheres of responsibility, and councils express the mind of the whole church together. And so no single bishop could claim immediate authority everywhere. So the East often distinguishes primacy, that is a place of honor and precedence, from supremacy, a universal governing right. And that becomes one of the greatest fault lines between the East and the West. Another objection is the local episcopal objection that bishops are not papal delegates. Even in the West, many bishops and theologians resisted the idea that bishops govern merely as delegates of the Pope. And they argue a bishop's authority in his diocese is ordinary and proper, not borrowed from somebody else outside. He is accountable to Christ and to the church's discipline, not simply just to Rome. And that papal intervention should be rare and exceptional, not something that's constant and normal. So in other words, they didn't deny order. They resisted over-centralization. Well, what's the real issue underneath all of this? At bottom, the debate is often about the question, where is the visible finality in the church's governance? Is finality located in a universal bishop, the Pope? Or is it finally located in a universal council? Or is finality located in Scripture with councils as ministerial and fallible means of judgment? So medieval Christians differed sharply, but they shared one conviction: Christ rules his church, and the church must have some visible means of guarding unity, discipline, and doctrine. So in fairness, we should say that papal defenders were often motivated by a desire to preserve apostolic collegiality and to resist overreach. And their argument is not simply power versus purify. It's a clash of ecclesiologies, two competing visions of how Christ's authority is visibly exercised. So as we look at this, we've seen that this has occurred over time and practice and titles and documents and theology. All this growth of the papacy is best understood as not one cause, but as a convergence. bureaucracy plus law plus politics plus symbols plus theology plus texts. And so we can move into kind of a final synthesis here, what changed, why it mattered, and what long-term tensions created in the medieval Christendom by it, before we open the floor for questions. So how did papal authority work on the ground? I'll give you some case histories or case studies in this. Medieval Christians experienced all of this in real disputes, contested elections, discipline cases, jurisdiction fights, appeals. So I'll give you a couple of short case studies, not to overwhelm you with names and dates, but to show you the logic of the system and why people either welcomed Rome's intervention or they resisted it. So case study A, we'll call it, a deposed bishop appeals to Rome, which deals with matters of discipline and due process. Imagine you've got a bishop in a regional church who's accused, perhaps of misconduct, maybe of doctrinal error, perhaps simply because he's offended a powerful local faction or ruler. A local synod meets and deposes him. Now, the deposed bishop says, "This is unjust. My enemies control the synod. I wasn't given a fair hearing." What's he do? He appeals to Rome. Why? This intervention with Rome accomplishes this. Rome reopens the case. They request records, testimony, reasons. Sometimes Rome will summon representatives. And then Rome judges the judgment. You see, Rome is not merely judging the bishop. Rome is judging the local synod's decision. That's key here. And Rome will either overturn or confirm. If Rome overturns, the bishop's restored. If Rome confirms, the deposition is strengthened. Now, why do people welcome this? Well, one, it could protect a bishop from tyranny, from corruption or political manipulation. And it could also enforce due process when local systems are weak. But why would people resist this? Well, local bishops asked, who gave Rome the right to be our court? Local synods would feel that they are undermined. Are our councils meaningless? And secular rulers resented outside interference. So once such appeals become normal, Rome functions as a supreme court. And once Rome is treated as a supreme court, the claim of universal jurisdiction becomes much easier for them to assert. We have always been the final court, therefore we are the final court. Another case study to look at the logic in all this. Let's say you've got a monastery who seeks exemption from local episcopal control. And this deals with privileges and direct Roman ties. Let's say a monastery's grown wealthy and influential, and the local bishop wants to come in and inspect it, to tax it, to appoint its leaders as abbots, or to discipline its monks. And the monks say, this bishop is overreaching or corrupt or simply hostile to us. And so the monastery seeks a papal privilege or exemption, a document that places the monastery under Rome's direct protection rather than under the ordinary jurisdiction of the local bishop. But what this changes here? The monastery's loyalty is redirected. It looks to Rome as its protector and judge. And the bishop's ordinary authority is bypassed. Even if that bishop remains spiritually responsible in some sense, practically the monastery has created a legal escape route. And Rome gains a local foothold, in this sense, everywhere. You multiply this across many monasteries and clerics and regions, and Rome gains a web of direct relationships, an administrative network inside the church. Now, why would some people welcome this? Well, monasteries could be shielded from abusive bishops or political entanglements, and reform-minded communities could claim protection for stricter discipline and purity. But why would there be pushback against it? Because bishops argued, look, these exemptions fracture the local church, and it creates two tracks of authority, the local bishop and Rome. And it trains institutions to appeal upward rather than to resolve issues locally. So privileges and exemptions make papal supremacy structural. Rome's no longer only a distant voice. Rome becomes the direct overseer of many institutions scattered throughout the West. And so these two cases show the same underlying pattern. Appeals would make Rome a universal court, and privileges and exemptions create a universal network. And so papal supremacy was not merely a theory, it becomes a lived reality through repeated situations where people, sometimes for good reasons, prefer a distant central authority over nearby contested authority. And so as we look at this whole thing, the growth of the papacy could be summed up in this way. In the medieval West, the Bishop of Rome moved from a respected center of influence to a centralized office claiming universal jurisdiction through a convergence of practice, of law, of politics, of titles, of documents, and theology. You have this stacking effect of all these various things together bring about what we see with the later medieval papacy itself. Well, we've got about 14 minutes or so, and let's talk about some of these issues here. The question, first one, having to do primacy versus supremacy. What is the difference between the primacy of honor and supremacy of jurisdiction? Let's see if we can pull up chat. There we go. All right. What is kind of the pivot in this lecture? Well, primacy is precedence. There's this respect and influence. Supremacy is governing authority, binding legal power over bishops and churches. So the pivot comes when Rome becomes a regular court of appeal and when papal decisions function as binding precedent and not merely just pastoral advice. And the practical mechanism that made this feel normal was appeals becoming customary, the decretals from Rome becoming law, and exemptions end up tying the institutions directly to Rome itself. And so, you have people looking to Rome first for its direction as opposed to the local governance and oversight of their bishop. So did papal supremacy grow first as a practice and then receive a theological explanation, or did theology drive the practice from the first? I think a lot of it is kind of a backwards process. You arrive at a certain point, and people begin to question, well, how did it get this way? And those who want to preserve the system will reach back and have various interpretations of Scripture, kind of a backwards justification, as opposed to, okay, we're going to study the Scriptures, this is what we believe, and we're going to build upon that basis. But sometimes it can be both and. This whole primacy arises. Rome at first is consulted and then appealed to and increasingly used as a court. And then these theological frameworks, the text with Peter, the arguments from unity, and legal collections then develop to justify and stabilize what is happening. But theology also influenced practice by shaping expectations of unity and leadership. It's often that way in the Roman Church, you see various practices arising in various places, but it's only later do they become made official. It becomes cemented into church law itself over time. That means, one particular party has achieved um, or finds useful the particular practice and therefore codifies it. This is what the church believes is more of a recognition of a practice as opposed to establishment of a practice. And so we see various doctrines in the Roman Church, various decretals issuing with regards to Mary and to papal authority and papal infallibility and so forth. Um, those weren't doctrines that were just invented brand new on the spot and then published. They were reflective of various practices and finally were codified in the church. Were those practices right? And well, we would say in many cases, no, they were not. They were not on biblical foundation. But you practice something and you do something over centuries, it becomes ingrained habit, and that's awfully hard to break its hold over a people. You tell a lie loud enough and long enough, it eventually becomes received truth. Notice I say receive, it's not the truth, it's received as truth by people. They have that assumption that that's how it is. Um, these forgeries, of course, quite troubling. But once the documents are proven to be forgeries, yeah, it kind of lessens the argument that the church has, but understand the church's claim of papal supremacy and universality um, don't rest just on the documents themselves. Um, yeah, it pulls a pillar out from under them in that regard, but the whole building rests on several pillars, and so it might weaken things a little bit in one area, but it's still resting on these other pillars themselves. And so um, I'm imagine it's quite dismaying, but the church did not, the Roman Church did not decide to pack up their tent and leave because these things were shown as false. They just, okay, that's bad, and we recognize it as false. But oh, by the way, we rest on these other things as well. And so that's why there's not one key thing um, that you pull away, um, and therefore everything comes tumbling down. There's a game that came over to the States from Korea called Jenga, and basically you have these wooden um, blocks and you stack them into a tower, and then the game is you take turns pulling out one of those until the whole building finally falls, so forth. And so you take out the forged documents and so forth. The whole building doesn't collapse in that regard. The risks of unity in one office are you could have a corrupt pope. How do you deal with the corruption and the excesses of that one pope? Um, you know, the whole legal procedure, appeals, protections, exemptions, um, all of them can make a very complex organization. And so if you study the Roman Catholic Church today and its organizational structure and how it does things, it is and because you have those who are under local authority and those who are under the direct protection of the Pope, and where the lines are, it is just um, mind-boggling to be able to look at the various organizations and structures, and especially with a worldwide office itself. So you've got this Vatican bureaucracy that has come about. And there are various attempts at reforming the bureaucracies and rooting out corruption in them that occurs. But because this very complex structure has arisen, it makes the reform of the Roman Church that much harder to accomplish and to achieve. All right, I'll entertain. Do we have any questions or comments from you folks this evening? All right then. Well, I appreciate your time this evening. This is a lot to take in, but it kind of gives us some idea here of how to explain a development with multiple causes, the practice, law, politics, titles, documents, theology, without reducing it to a slogan. And that's exactly the skill medieval church history requires of us when we are examining it. Well, we will put this recording up in our Dropbox folder, and I'll put the link to it and the other materials in the Facebook Messenger chat for the Lord's Seminary. And God willing, we'll get together next Tuesday. Just to give you a heads up, we will take 2 weeks off, the last Tuesday in April and the first Tuesday in May, because we will be in the process of moving to Texas to take care of my 93-year-old father, and also to take up a new pastorate there in Texas. So the Lord bless you this evening. Have a good night's rest, and we'll see each other, Lord willing, next week.
Thank you very much, Dr. John.
Okay, very good. Good night, brothers.